Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Last year, as COVID lockdowns crippled the economy, governments across the country rolled out program after program to help Canadians. As weeks turned into months and now months have turned into a year, many are asking just how the government is going to pay for all these programs. Well, on April 19th, the federal government will be releasing its first budget in 2 years, and many of us will be looking to have those questions answered. However, the Ontario government just released its budget. And with 1 in 3 Canadians living in Ontario, this will have an impact not just on Ontarians, but also beyond our borders here in Ontario. So what did the budget say? Was there a slash and burn approach to spending, or will the government continue on its current path of doling out tax dollars to help Ontarians recover from the COVID crisis? Well, joining me now to help unpack the Ontario budget is Elliot Hughes, Senior Advisor at Summa Strategies, and David Clement, North American Affairs Manager for Consumer Choice Centre. Welcome, gentlemen. I appreciate your time here as we unpack this budget. So let's dig right in. So, big surprise, I'm a kind of tighten the purse strings kind of gal, a fiscal conservative. So when I saw this budget, to me, it seemed quite bloated, kind of like a feel-good budget. Overall, what were your general thoughts on the Ontario budget? I'll start with you, Elliot, please.
Well, I thought it felt as though the Ford government was, had one foot still in the pandemic and one foot out of it, hoping to have a little bit more in the economic recovery bucket. And I think, in a way, it represents well where we find ourselves in Ontario and, frankly, across the country, which is we've got this hope of the vaccines coming in, but we're still very much seeing the third wave, seeing some spikes in COVID cases, and so the governments are still having to deal with it. So I think the Ford government was hoping to be able to be a little bit more forward-leaning into the economic recovery as they bear down on an election next June in 2022. But they're still, I think, understanding and having to deal with the here and now, and that's probably frustrating for them. But at the same token, it's understandable.
Okay, good comments, David. What were your takeaways? What are your general thoughts on this Ontario budget?
Yeah, I think Elliot's assessment in terms of being still stuck in pandemic mode is pretty accurate. I think in a perfect world, our vaccine procurement would be a lot more along the road than maybe what the Ford government initially expected. I think that if we were more in line with the UK or some of the other countries who seem to have vaccine availability and are rolling it out quickly, we'd probably be able to have more of that conversation about what the economic plan looks like. I am concerned about the debt levels. I mean, while Kathleen Wynne was premier, we were the most heavily indebted sub-sovereign unit in the world. Obviously, that circumstance is not getting better. So I would like to see some proactive measures from the Ford government on what they're going to do to spur growth, because that's really an important conversation, because obviously we can tax our way to try and balance the budget. But another factor there is spurring growth and generating revenue from growth. And so I think that there are some interesting ideas put forward that could be implemented to help speed that process along.
Okay, you brought up some excellent points, and I actually want to address some of the comments and points with respect to the budget and the vaccine rollout. We'll do that in a little bit in this last minute before we go to commercial. One thing that stood out for me, and again, I'm quite the fiscal conservative, is that Ontario doesn't plan to balance its budget until 2029, 2030, till that fiscal year. That's 8 or 9 years away. Is this indicative of how long you think it was going to take for Ontario to get out of this current crisis, Elliot?
Well, I think so. I mean, and in that budget, they painted 3 scenarios. The one that you just laid out is, in fact, the middle of the road. That's, things progress in a pretty good way. If things get really good and the economy is really booming, we might see a little bit earlier than that. But if it lags a little bit, which there is some fear around that, it could take even longer. Look, Ontario is going to be $500 billion in debt by 2024. All governments around the world are having to deal with this, and the Ford government, finds itself in a situation where it has to deal with it as well. And I know that's tough for them, because I think there are some folks in that party who are probably also quite fiscally conservative and who are probably upset with where they're at. But I don't know, as the minister laid out, I don't know if there was any other approach for them to take. And that's something that obviously could be debated. But I think it's the sensible approach that has been taken around the world. It seems to be regarded as the best approach at this point.
Okay, we're going to pick up this discussion right when we return. Welcome back. We're having a fun discussion on the Ontario budget. It's actually not that fun because we're discussing what it's going to take to get Canada, to get Ontario specifically, out of this fiscal mess we're in due to the pandemic. Joining me now to help explain what has been revealed to us in the latest Ontario budget is Elliot Hughes and David Clement. Thank you again, gentlemen, for joining me. I know I'm very grim with things. When I see large numbers like $38.5 billion as being our latest deficit, it shocks me. Or I should say $33 billion. That is what is the projected deficit for the next fiscal year. That's a slight decrease from the previous year, so I suppose that's a good thing. But that's a huge deficit. And I appreciate that we're still not yet seeing the end of this COVID crisis. But how does one wrap their head around these figures? How do we ever think that we're going to get out of this debt? David, comments?
Well, I worry that the reaction, when it's appropriate, is going to be to increase taxes across the board. And I worry that that's the approach because so many people obviously have had tremendous financial uncertainty in the pandemic. And the last thing I want to see is the tax man show up at the door and basically take more of people's pay. What I can say is that there are some policies that could be done to spur growth. The Montreal Economic Institute report, I believe it was today, estimated that GDP growth would increase by over 3% a year if we got rid of interprovincial trade barriers. Right. Now, Ontario cannot do that for other provinces, but they can certainly do that for themselves. And so I would love to see a plan on that issue in particular to say, okay, Ontario truly is open for business. We're getting rid of all of these silly interprovincial trade barriers that never really should have existed. And we're going to rely to some extent on growth to help cover our budget deficits moving forward, to try and narrow that number from 2029 downward. I think that that's the more sensible approach. And I think that that's something that Ontarians can get behind because everyone, and as Elliot has rightly pointed out, we're in the middle of a 100-year pandemic. These are unprecedented circumstances, as cliche as that sounds. So I think it just requires some vision on what we can do moving forward so that it isn't just isn't just changes to tax policy that ultimately takes more money out of the pockets of everyday Ontarians.
Okay, so I appreciate what you said, and I completely agree with you that if we reduced a lot of the interprovincial trade barriers or even red tape in some circumstances, then we would truly be open for business, as Premier Doug Ford says. But I can't even think about being open for business when a good chunk of the province is simply locked down and is simply closed for business. And I think that is... speaking to some, lay Ontarians, they say, well, what's the point of even presenting a budget when we're simply not open? But I said, it's been 2 years, almost 2 years. We need to know what what the situation in our province is. And if we look at the interest charges on the debt that we're going to be paying, it's costing $13 billion a year. That's $1 billion a month we're paying to service our debt. And we have, as I said before, we haven't seen the end of this yet. How can we discuss GDP growth when we don't even know when we're going to be available, our province, to open to growth? Elliot, thoughts?
Well, I think that the economic plan that the government of Ontario needs to come up with probably involves a couple things. Unfortunately, I think part of that is going to be tax increases. I don't think that's avoidable. I think there is a sense across the G7 that taxes are being raised. You see the Biden administration's looking at it. We're doing the same thing in the UK. Whether that's a mix of personal and business, We'll have to get there. I think you're also going to have to think about some growth programs to help spur economic growth and some select industries, whether that be advanced manufacturing, for example, and really try to start growing that. So rather than trying to claw our way back in the same size economy, we're actually expanding the economy. And that's, I think, what we need to do is try and think about what are some of those high growth areas where we can really drive some economic growth, create jobs, increase tax dollars across the board. You'll have to remember that last year in the second quarter alone, Ontarians saved $150 billion. So that wasn't the women and the folks who are working in the hospitals. This was probably from those who are able to work from home in professional jobs and who probably tend to make a little bit more income as well. Mm-hmm. Is there an opportunity to raise the taxes on those folks who frankly, I think have been doing pretty good during this pandemic and aren't the ones who are feeling the brunt of this? So I think there's a mix of things that the government needs to do to grow out of this, but certainly it's not an easy position, and the Ford government has a really tough hill to climb in the coming months and years.
Yeah, you brought up a good point about the potential of raising personal taxes. I know as we await the federal budget in a few weeks, there has been some talk about everybody paying their fair share, and what that would look like, I guess we'll have to stay tuned for a couple of weeks. But we're going to pick up this discussion and examine more in detail what happened with the Ontario budget right when we return. So this is for the Ontario budget we're examining. Of course, we're going to look at the federal budget in just a few weeks. I want to start with healthcare because obviously this is top of mind probably for most Ontarians. It usually is in a general election year, let alone a year when we've had lots of healthcare woes thrown our way. So let's look at COVID spending going forward. So the province is committing $1 billion towards a vaccination plan. I know we talked briefly about this, David, and $2.3 billion in new money for testing and contact tracing. Are these non-negotiables? Is this throwing good money after good, or is it throwing good money after bad? I only mention this because I know some persons who have already been vaccinated seem to get they get re-diagnosed with COVID, and I'm just concerned, if we're throwing a lot of money towards vaccination, is there still a reason that we should be doing contact tracing, et cetera? David, what are your thoughts?
Well, my hope would be that the vaccination rollout would go so successfully that the need for investing in contact tracing becomes lessened as the program rolls out. Because as you progress, as we reach a rate of vaccination like what we're seeing in a country like Israel, you start to see less and less of a need for additional investments in contact tracing and things like that. Now, I think the reason why it's included is because there's still uncertainty on if or when we're going to get there. And so it's possible that we're still having a conversation about whether or not we can see our loved ones at Christmas. And that is, incredibly depressing for me to say, but it's the truth.
Yes. If
we could have something where the investment in the vaccine rollout actually multiplies the rate in which we're vaccinating people, my hope is that earmarked money for contact tracing is less needed and maybe can be used elsewhere.
Well, and I suspect some of this money is being set aside as we hear of in the news a lot of these new variants that have crept across our borders from various, you hear about the UK variant, the Brazil variant, the South Africa variant. I don't know. Everybody seems to have a variant now. So, perhaps that's also why they're kind of going down that way. $5.1 billion for hospitals, including 3,100 for including money for 3,100 new beds. I remember early days in the COVID crisis, I guess it was April last year, Premier Ford kept saying, we're going to build 3,000 beds. We need all these new beds for ICU beds to deal with the influx of patients, which never really got to that point. Is this now the government playing catch up, Elliot? Do you have any thoughts on that? And by the way, this $5.1 billion includes 2 new hospitals for both Brampton and Windsor, Essex, which I think are long overdue, especially with Brampton. Elliot, your thoughts?
I think investments in healthcare is a good idea, both politically and socially. It ranks usually very close, if not number one, in terms of issues for voters. And 2, having a good healthcare system, I think, is just a good thing to have, particularly as a G7 country. I think some of the challenging pieces in this budget are these pretty massive cuts to education, close to $800 million. And this gets back to a point that we were talking about before. If you want to grow an economy in the future, the last thing you should do is cut education. These young kids in the schools are the ones who are going to be the one creating jobs, who are going to be creating companies, and frankly could be the ones who are going to come up with that big idea that's going to help grow the Ontario economy. Investing in schools and education, to me, makes a lot of sense as an economic argument, not only as a social argument. So, I sometimes struggle understanding the Ford government's approach to some of this. They say they want a good economy, and yet they're cutting the biggest feeder program to that economy, and that's education. So sometimes I get a little bit of mixed messages. I think the investments in healthcare, though, do make sense. And hopefully, as was pointed out, we don't necessarily need to use all of it. And things, the vaccination plan gets a little looks a little better over the coming months.
Now, let me just ask you just a follow-up question about that 800 million, which I believe is the figure you quoted as being clawed back, if you will, for education or cut. Was that because I remember the government did give, several hundreds of millions of dollars this year for extra COVID spending. And I'm wondering if this is just the clawing back of that extra money for the pandemic time, or is this just a cut right to the base?
I feel this is the 800 million comes from a reduction in this a program that was running before this, not the federal dollars, but it was a provincial program that has now been cut. And so they put in 750 million or thereabouts in this budget, but overall that comes out at a loss at about 800 million. The federal dollars that was sent for the restart, I think there's still a lot of question marks around where that's gone, how effective that's been, who it's reaching, how impactful it's been, and who's tracking that, which I think is a whole other set of concerns.
Okay, we're going to pick this up right when we return. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our dissection on the Ontario budget that was just released in the last few days. David, we were talking before we went to commercial about the cuts to education that have occurred. But when, I'm a mother of 5 children, I speak to all sorts of parents and, be it at the socially distanced playground or in the park or whatnot. A lot of parents have withdrawn their children from the classroom this year. And I'm saying they're not even engaging in synchronous learning. They're simply homeschooling them. And so it seems that enrollment has reduced significantly, or quite a chunk at least in Ontario. And of course, we'll wait for those figures by the end of the year. Does that make sense then that the government would claw back spending or cut back if there are fewer children enrolled? To me, that makes sense. Fewer children enrolled, then why do we need as much dollars thrown at the system? David, thoughts?
Yeah, I think the more appropriate way, rather than looking at this as the nominal figure of whatever is less in the budget, it should be looked at in terms of the price or cost per student. That's, I think, the more appropriate lens to evaluate this. But I actually disagree with the perspective that a cut in education spending automatically means poorer outcomes, because it really depends on what we're cutting. And I'll use university and post-secondary education as an example. If we are streamlining and reducing administration costs, which if you've taken a step inside a Canadian university, or in particular any of the ones in Ontario recently, you will quite clearly see that the administrative side of the university is incredibly bloated. Mm-hmm. You could argue that you could reduce those costs quite significantly, maintaining or even increasing spending on professors and academic focused spending, and have cuts to education while actually still improving outcomes. So it really depends on what we're cutting. I don't think that throwing the large figure of however hundreds of millions of dollars it is automatically means poor outcomes, because ultimately, really the question is, where do the dollars come from? Is it fewer teachers? Is it fewer administrators? Mm-hmm. Where are those cuts, and how does that actually impact outcomes?
Right. And I guess, again, my point is this to do with fewer COVID cleaners? Because I know there were extra custodian staff hired. There were extra facilitators for online learning. And we don't know what the environment will be for learning come fall. I know we keep talking about, what I thought was going to be the 3rd wave, but it sounds like it'll be the 4th wave, I suppose, by fall. I don't know. I'm losing track. Let's shift gears for a second and talk about small businesses. The cliche is that they're the backbone of our economy, but it's true. They are. And in Ontario, the small businesses have accumulated over $200,000 in COVID-related debt. So now the government's offering another grant between $20,000 to $40,000 in their budget to help offset, I guess, some of the losses from these businesses if they're even still operational. To me, this didn't seem like enough for these businesses. I mean, they're being forced to close by the government, and then here's perhaps a small pittance to offset your costs if you can even stay open. Am I completely off base here, Elliot?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the Ford government finds itself in a tough position when it comes to small business. Grants are fine, but they're not giveaways. I mean, these are things that are going to have to be paid back and worked off. And so that puts these businesses who are in an awful situation here, having to close and react to the pandemic and so forth, and the orders from the provincial government, which is why you have the provincial government, going into the red so much. They've stepped up. They've helped small businesses across the province, as had the federal government. And this gets back to, I think, our original point, which is there really was no other option here. So as much as I don't think anyone of us like the fact that we're in the red so much,
right.
But the alternative would have been, businesses collapsing, millions of people out of work, which is a far worse outcome. So I think we just also need to remember when we look at the spending, we need to remember that it was done for a reason, and that the other approach, is almost unfathomable, and we should be, thankful in a sense for governments for stepping in as well.
Okay, different perspectives, but always interesting. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me.
Thank you.
I don't like going into debt. None of us do. But clearly, with what's gone on this year economically, with potentially a self-induced economic crisis, with COVID, we need to do something. This is a very strange budget, but again, it's a strange time. As the government prepares for its next scheduled election, which is June 2022, there was a lot of candy in here, a lot of fat to be given. But who knows? Premier Doug Ford could pull the trigger early, and we could be in an election, who knows, as early as this summer. We'll have to keep our eye on this. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.